All right. So, no surprise here, but Shaw will be moderating the second and final players and media panel. And before we get started, I'll run through the bios of our panelists here. So, Meg Linehan is a staff writer for The Athletic, focusing on the NWSL, U.S. Women's National Team, and the world of women's soccer. She'll be covering the 2021 Olympics and 2023 Women's World Cup. Meg is also the host of a weekly digital show, The Fixture, which is focused on international women's soccer and is presented by the International Champions Cup. Our second panelist is Grant Wahl. Grant is a sports journalist who spent 24 years with Sports Illustrated and also had a lengthy spell with Fox Sports. Grant's a best-selling author with some of his books, including Masters of Modern Soccer and The Beckham Experiment. He's also the host of the Planet Football podcast. Our third and final panelist is Alexi Lalas, who's a member of the National Soccer Hall of Fame, featuring for the U.S. men's national team in the 1994 World Cup. Alexi had an illustrious MLS career and was the first American to play in the Serie A in Italy. And Alexi is currently a lead studio analyst at Fox Sport. So, Shaw, I'll hand it back over to you and let's get started.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Meg, I don't know you as well as the other two, so feel free to jump in anytime you want. We'll start with you, Alexi, and we'll start with it's an international week. I don't want your thoughts on the US-Wales game because I think everybody's talked it to death, but just how quickly opinions or thoughts can change about the last 3 years compared to some young kids came out on a pitch, knocked the ball around for 90 minutes, and maybe made some U.S. soccer fans feel better. Just how quickly something like that can change, and your role in that too.
Oh, well, I don't have a role in that. You can hear me, right? You can hear me? Okay. First off, thank you. Thank you for having me, this distinguished panel, even you, Shaw. This is an amazing year in so many different ways. And, obviously to see the U.S. team play this past week and to see it back on the field was great. But then you add the fact with all the excitement. And we were saying on the broadcast that 3 years ago, it was, I would argue, the darkest time when it comes to and the way we look at this U.S. men's national team, not qualifying for the World Cup. And then 3 years later, right now, I'm hard pressed to find a moment where we've been more optimistic, and rightfully so. And even after that 90 minutes, I still remain incredibly bullish about this group. Doesn't mean we're going to win the World Cup when it comes to the men's side, but this was a fun week, and these are the little things in 2020 that keep us going. So hopefully we're heading in the right direction, both on and off the field. But I'm sure we'll have plenty of other challenges as we go on, whether it has to do with the U.S. men's national team soccer or anything else in life.
Meg, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of done. Like, we've had the NWSL expansion draft for this year. So we're now kind of maybe looking at a slightly calmer offseason, although NWSL is never calm. We're waiting to see if the U.S. women's national team actually ends up playing a friendly in the Netherlands. I think we might have a slight problem pulling that one off. But yeah, I mean, I think it has been a very interesting 2020 for women's soccer. I think a lot of people went into this year expecting a lot after 2019. Obviously, things kind of went off the rails, and then NWSL emerged stronger than I think anyone could have anticipated, with new media deals, new sponsorships, record-breaking TV viewership. So it's definitely been a very interesting time to cover the sport.
What about you, Grant? There's been a strange
What's the question? Oh, yeah.
It's been a bit of a strange year for you, but just like even coming from just last week, where a couple of days ago, where the U.S. men's played with a bunch of players that 2 years ago nobody would have expected to be capped, to all the way back to February when they played the last game, and there was a lot of, oh boy, here we go.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a big change with the U.S. men's national team and just how the fans feel right now. And I still think there's a lot of scarring, that scar tissue is still there from not making it in 2018. And I think it's going to take maybe getting off to a good start in World Cup qualifying to remove some of that. But, we can see these guys every week now playing for Juventus and Barcelona and Chelsea and Dortmund and Leipzig and all these teams. And that's exciting. We see it in Champions League. So I think it was good to see the U.S. men's national team back on the field. And that's just a start. And the result didn't really matter so much as just seeing these guys out there trying stuff, and the chemistry is going to come.
Alexi, back to you. It's not just the men's players now that are out in Europe knocking it about, but this morning we saw Tobin Heath and Kristen Press and Sam Ewis, and for some reason Rose Lavelle didn't get off the bench. Like, it's an amazing time to be a soccer fan of all things United States men and women.
It is. I mean, you mentioned Rose. I mean, the consternation that I woke up to this morning that I know was out there in that soccer community, that, you know, we're wasting this incredible talent, and it's too good for England and all that. That's great. I mean, that's wonderful for soccer. I mean, the interesting thing is to juxtapose between when male American players go over. You know, they're going over and they're looked at coming from a nation, obviously, where soccer isn't king, and we certainly haven't produced in any historical way great teams or great players relative to the rest of the world. But the opposite is true when women players go over from the U.S. and they're coming over like a Brazilian would come over, and that's great. I mean, obviously, it's reflective of the incredible history and success that we have had. But then the whistle blows, and you have to perform. And look, those of us that had the incredible privilege and opportunity to have those experiences, you know I grew as a player, and I know I grew as a person. And so the kicking of the ball, yeah, that's great, and you do learn in those environments. But just the experience, and I know England doesn't necessarily have a different language, although we can debate that, but just the experience and the culture and the different way that the culture looks at soccer and goes about that game, you know, they will, whenever they decide to come back, and maybe it'll be a long time, maybe it'll be a short time, but whenever they come back, they will bring back those tools and those skills and that experience that will make them not just better players, but I think better people going forward. So I think it's a great experience. It's wonderful for us to get up, and either it's early in the morning or during the day, and cheer on these teams that in normal times we may cheer them on. But now with that American connection, we see it, whether it's with a Rose or with Christian Pulisic, even those teams that might not be your traditional type of teams that you follow or that you are fans of necessarily, as soon as they have an American player, they become very, very interesting very, very quickly. And that's that American soccer culture gravitating and celebrating what our players are doing.
Meg, he touched on, Alexi just touched on it a lot. When a U.S. men's player does sign at a big club, it's huge. Will he play? And then, yeah, he's playing. But when Alex went over to Spurs, and Mewis and Rose went over to Man City, like, it's a big deal. But what is it like in the women's national team or women's fan group community? How do they perceive these moves?
I mean, I think the moves were obviously big news, right? There's also inevitably, I think within maybe the strong women's soccer community, there's not necessarily a lot of worry. I think what happens is players go over, right? Maybe sign either a loan or a short contract. And then a lot of people who are not as familiar with women's soccer immediately go, is the NWSL dying because every single player is leaving, right? So we go through this cycle again and again and again. And it's happened. I mean, every time Alex Morgan has decided to play outside of America, we get this news cycle. So there's that part of it. But I think internally, people who are like kind of living the day-to-day of women's soccer look at this as a good thing. Like, NWSL needs competition for its players. Also, WSL growing stronger, some of these other leagues growing stronger, and also having television deals in the US. Like, that's another key part of this. This game was on NBC Sports this morning, right? So people are now able to watch these games and have more, like, we've just never really had the access to international club soccer on the women's side in this meaningful fashion. So now that people are able to kind of see the spectrum of international domestic soccer and see how these leagues might interact with each other and compete with each other, I think we're going to be able to have much better nuanced conversations around them. But in terms of like the actual signing, right? I know Grant I saw someone reply to Grant this morning when he was like, Sam Mewis has owned WSL this morning, and someone wanted to argue immediately, like, Tobin Heath has done it, like, same stats, half the games, whatever. So like, we're actually now starting to get this infrastructure, right? Like, that's still the work that needs to be done. And I think having players move and having this be major stories and earn actual like game day coverage. We're not just getting like individual stories of like, this is the WSL or this is the NWSL or is the NWSL going to die? Like people are watching and tuning into these games now. That's happened on the NWSL on a more regular fashion. Like that's why these signings are very important.
Grant, it's been a strange year for NWSL, obviously, but also an awesome year for them. First professional league back. Ratings have been amazing. But how does it cement themselves? How do they cement themselves as the league of choice for all great women's players?
I mean, I think number one, there's a long list, right? I think NWSL has always really gone out front and said like we are the best women's league in the world, and I think they've had a decent claim on it, partially because of the parity, right? And I don't think that's changed. Angel City coming in as an expansion team has been like a huge boost for this league, right? But I think the other part now that we need to see is still increased salaries, a collective bargaining agreement with actual NWSL players, and then as part of that, free agency. Because when players are able to like have freedom of movement and feel like they are earning their worth and their value, like that's when you're going to see a little bit more movement. I think, I think also we have to get through COVID-19 in this country because currently we're not necessarily the most attractive place to come play.
Grant, you want to follow up?
I mean, you look at, I think competition is good. And, this is a new development, right, where we can see games from England, women's club games on TV easily in the United States. You can see Champions League games to some extent, at least we saw CBS get the final 8. And so, I think some of these big clubs in Europe are realizing that it doesn't take that much money to invest in the women's game to compete quickly and to compete with the NWSL and get players. And so I think that's good by putting pressure on the NWSL to be able to compete and pay higher salaries and do what it takes here in North America and the US to get good ratings, to improve the television product, which they've done this year, to get more sponsorships, to have expansion. And it's pretty amazing actually when you look at all that happening in 2020 during a pandemic. But it was really important for Lisa Baird, who came in as commissioner, and the first thing she's dealing with is this health crisis, to respond in the way that she did and to get that bubble tournament organized before anybody else did, sports-wise, in the US, and have it come off well. So I give her a lot of credit, and I feel like they're on a really good trajectory. And once we get on the other side of the virus, it could get even better,
Alexi, you've been able to be involved with a couple of Women's World Cups now and national team games. So obviously you've seen a lot of football over the last few years, women's football too. What have you seen this year in the NWSL that I mean, like I said, first professional league back, but also just in general, their ability to grow on what they've been doing all through this terrible health crisis?
Well, I mean, first off, this is a business, and these are all businesses. These are not charities. And, yes, you have responsibilities that go well beyond what happens on the field. But, ultimately, I think that looking at it as a business is important. And obviously, all businesses, have gone through the challenge in 2020. And so your ability to be flexible, your ability to change. And, you mentioned the bubble. And it's not just, having the Utah bubble, but it's also promoting it and making sure that people understand that it's going on, understand where it is in terms of when it came on, and little things, and constantly chipping away to get to get to that point where you are being relevant. And I mean, they like we've been talking about, whether it's just the news that has been generated, whether it is the ratings that have been generated, and once again, whether it's just the relevancy when it comes to women's soccer in the form of NWSL, you take lemons and you make lemonade, and that's really what they have done. And really, it applies to not just soccer, but everything in 2020. You have to have the ability to change. We all know it sucks. We all know that it's never going to be fair or ideal in any way, but it's making the best of a bad situation. And I think the NWSL deserves a tremendous amount of credit for taking a crap situation with all the challenges, even in normal times that they face, and making something that is memorable, something that is worth praising, something that they can point to, and something that ultimately should make everybody, that's off the field, the men and women that worked hard to make it happen, incredibly proud. Make all of the men and women that work in terms of the product that's put on the field incredibly proud, and ultimately make all of us from a soccer perspective very, very, very proud. So, that's for me is what, and I would say that about any business. If you are able in 2020 to find ways to survive and in maybe some ways change things, and some stuff that you throw against the wall sticks, that's ingenuity. That's being flexible, and that's being creative in a moment where we are all going through challenges and there are all sorts of obstacles over there. And that's, as I said, that's ingenuity. And that comes down to people. That comes down to people doing the work, having the ideas, and the support to say, we're going to do this. And yes, there are risks, and yes, there are challenges going forward, and we will make mistakes going forward, but ultimately we're going to come out the other side. So it is, to your point, I think Grant or Meg said, to your point, that 2020 in all of its crappiness, okay, will maybe look back as that seminal moment when things really, really changed. And so you made something of a crap situation.
Grant, MLS 25th season. It started off, I think, with a huge bang. People were really excited at the start of the season. Some great matches right at the start of the season. Obviously, then COVID comes in a couple of weeks in. What are your thoughts on how they have been able to negotiate all of this, the bubble, and now they're still playing and they've got playoff games and MLS Cup's still coming? I mean, their ability to negotiate all of this.
Yeah. Before I forget here, I should say about Alexi, the previous panel was all athletes, former athletes, and this is a media panel. You have fully come to the dark side of the media now by being on this panel, Alexi.
True.
So welcome.
Gladly. I will bathe in the darkness.
And also, if you want to share your whatever endorsement deal you've got for hand sanitizer behind you with us, feel free on that.
All for you. This is all for you, Grant, right? There it is. All right. I'm doing my part.
Day one. There was only a small little canister in day one, and it's been growing.
But in terms of Shaw's question about MLS, I mean, I was really happy that the Supporters Shield got reinstated after we lost it briefly, because, and I know like Alexi talked a lot about this, there being an asterisk for a lot of people, and I get it, but to have it completely removed to me would have been a real shame, because I think MLS teams, staffs, players, coaches who've really fought and gone through a lot of hardship this season, this year, to get to this point where we are on the cusp of the playoffs, like, I think they deserve that, and so I just, as with NWSL fighting through things, like MLS and everything they did to get through a really, really hard year and get to the point where the playoffs are going to start. I get really excited for the MLS playoffs much more than I do actually for the regular season, because I think there's some of the best playoffs in sports. I think the single elimination has been good throughout the playoffs since that got added. I think the playoffs are so awesome. I wish they actually pulled a Mexico and had 2 seasons, an Apertura and a Clausura, and 2 playoffs, because I think the more MLS playoffs, the better.
You have lots to say then.
But like I'm fired up. I've got every MLS game, playoff game in my calendar ready to go here. I hope that this real surge in virus cases that we've got right now, which honestly is exponential and off the charts, I away from soccer, obviously, I hope that our country gets a handle on this, because it's looking really bleak right now. From a soccer perspective, I hope that they're able to go ahead with the playoffs after this international window and not have to cancel any games. But I feel like overall MLS can take some pride in how they've handled it to get to this point.
Meg, how hard has it been to cover sports this year?
Yeah, so in addition to all the work I do, I'm actually on the executive committee of the NWSL Media Association, which Grant is also a member of, and trying to figure out the logistics of how game coverage would work, right? Zoom calls, or I mean, for Challenge Cup, honestly, it was not entirely ideal because we would have to basically submit questions through a Slack that had been set up, and then the league's PR person would ask them. You did not necessarily have full control over the situation, right? So they were also, the answers were being live streamed on Twitch, which was not my favorite part. So, you know, it has been a very strange year. I think a lot of us, now that we are in November, have some Zoom burnout, but I do think that, you know, for women's soccer, we have always kind of had this negotiation of, I mean, I was in the room when we basically had to negotiate mix zones after NWSL games, right? So it has been this growth of, how do we have better access? How do we have better media coverage? And so 2020, it has been like just a kind of an aberration in terms of how this works. But I do think that some of it has been really good because, you know, before I might not have access to all of these teams because I'm based in New York City. I might get out to a Sky Blue game, but I'm not necessarily like in a regular access point to Portland Thorns, right? Like, but because of technology now and this year, I'm able to talk to these teams on a more regular basis. So there have been pros and cons. But I also do think that, you know, it is going to be very interesting to see once we're actually like back to stuff in person, if there's going to have to be like a negotiation process of like, no, we've got to bring back some of what's already been established. We've got to get back into these routines and all that kind of stuff.
I've noticed, Grant, that a lot of clubs around the world, it's been easier to do stuff with during this. One, you don't have to do it in person and people are sitting at home. So like for someone who doesn't just cover leagues, but also does a lot of travel around the world, like how has it affected you and what you've noticed, good and bad?
Well, this is where I say something about you that you're not going to say about yourself. The reason that CBS has gotten so many A-list guests for its CBS Champions League 8 shows on HQ is Shaw, because Shaw's got like 30 years of connections, and it's really hard to land good, you know, A-list interview guests, because I try and do this every week for my podcast. I have noticed like Jurgen Klopp, like the Liverpool coach, really got into a rhythm of doing Zoom interviews, including several with US outlets, and Alexi interviewed him, and you know, I did, and I think you guys got him, Shaw. Like, and I think clubs like Liverpool at the very high end are realizing that there can be a benefit to some of this stuff in terms of making people like Klopp accessible, and he seems to be willing to do it. And I'm really curious to see now what happens post-virus and how this might change the sort of media process, and whether they might be more comfortable with that, and I might travel less. I'm not, you know, I like travel, but if I don't have to travel as much, then maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing. And just, I think the culture, the way it is, it used to be that I had to like go to England or go to Spain to get a decent interview with somebody, and now you may not have to do that. And I think these big clubs in Europe, they want to get bigger in the US. And so I think they're often willing to do things to try and cater to the US market. So I think that's going to be a good thing for media, but also just for fans to be able to consume that stuff.
Alexi, we had a short-lived show that we did together that we had some really good guests on during the pandemic. I'm curious your thoughts and your advice you'd give to these clubs around the world that Americans are always seeking to hear from players and coaches and stuff.
Well, I don't necessarily think they need to hear it from me, but obviously this is an incredibly still emerging market that any club, especially in this age of thinking globally, is going to look at to try to win hearts and minds. And so the more that you can get in front of the people that are deciding and comparing and contrasting, and people that are coming into this incredibly interesting and growing soccer tent that we have, but also, you know, very, very different and times segmented, you got to do it. And so, you know, Grant talking about Klopp, they recognize that this is a place that they want to mine. And this goes for men's soccer, women's soccer, just soccer in general, because, these are attempting to be, some of them already are, but they're all attempting to be global brands, and they want to plant that flag. Well, you do that by being accessible, and access, to Meg's point, that's key. That's key for everything. It's what everybody's trying to get. And, clubs understand the leverage that they have. And you Shaw, can attest to this. They pick and choose, and it's about relationships and connections. And sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. But if you want to get into those hearts and minds of this emerging soccer culture, you got to be in front of them, and you have to be in front of them and coming to them in a way that we digest it, and it's changing constantly. And whether it's Zoom or anything else out there, you got to be constantly feeding this animal that is growing, that is American soccer, because it can go in so many different ways, as we know, because of just the unique aspects of American soccer without the long tradition and history. And with that constant compare and contrast with what's going on around the field, you got to find a way to be targeted and to be smart about the way you go doing these things. I'll just finish by saying, I want to travel. My wife right now, if everything would change, she would drive my ass to LAX right now and kick me out of the car. I mean, we're doing Zoom classes with my family here, and we're trying not to kill each other, but to have it stop immediately in March for a lifestyle where I was traveling every single week, and just cold turkey, it has been very, very difficult. And yes, we do complain at times about traveling, but there's also nothing like being able to go to different places and meet different people and have all of these different experiences. And I certainly miss those. And I don't know if that's going to come back. If that's gone, that's too bad. But there is a reality to some of the stuff, like I said, that's going to get thrown on that wall. Some of it won't stick, and some of it may. So it might be, whenever we get back to normal, it may just be a new normal that we're dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about relationships a lot, right? And what it can do and how to foster them correctly, and how all of a sudden someone says yes and you're like, oh my God, Jurgen Klopp's talking to Alexi about playing a guitar. But I'm curious how you balance the relationship with being the voice for a fan. I'll start with you, Alexi. How do you balance knowing somebody, whether it was a former teammate, now obviously less of those out on the pitch, I hate to say, Alexi, for you, but in general, how did you manage that moving forward all the time about being fair to the fan and honest with the fan compared to fostering that relationship you had or have?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't certainly do the amount of interviews that Grant and Meg do, but you have to establish some sort of rapport. But you also have to think about what you are doing. And you want to make sure that you are asking questions that people that are watching would have, and maybe some that they don't have. You want to make sure that when all is said and done, that people respect what you did. They might not always agree. And as a matter of fact, if you're going to try to get everybody to agree, it's going to be a long haul for you. So you have to recognize that you're going to make mistakes and that you're not going to be able to please everybody. As far as like the fan, I don't necessarily think about how the fan would go about doing it, because it's kind of for everybody that we're trying to do this. And that in of itself is a very, very difficult process. And you're never going to be able to, like I said, be everything to everybody. And in TV, we're dealing with very, very short periods of time, maybe 2-3 questions. So you got to really prioritize and be efficient about what you pick to ask and how you pick to ask it. And you hope that there's something interesting coming back. And the worst thing in the world is when you get some of these big names and they don't give you anything. But you're really cooking when you do get a big name and they do give you something, because you know that that's going to be of interest to a lot more people than normally would get it. And that's when you're cooking, but it doesn't always happen that way, as everybody can attest to.
Meg, what about you? How do you foster those relationships while being honest about someone out on the pitch, whether it's how they played or, something to that extent?
Yeah, I think in women's soccer, it's actually kind of interesting, because I think there is this expectation of there needs to be more honesty about the product, right? And I think that even players will admit, like, it should be like fair game to criticize if something is not going well. And like, I remember, and this is going back to my Boston Breakers days, but you know, they were occasionally extremely miserable to watch. And I remember walking up to Kat Whitehill after a game, and she just looked at me and she's just like, do you really have to do this? And I'm like, I mean, you can just start talking and then I don't have to do anything, you know? So I think sometimes it is building those relationships so that way sometimes you might also have the freedom to ask questions when the performance isn't good that maybe other folks wouldn't necessarily be comfortable. I mean, I've asked Carly Lloyd to her face why she has missed a penalty kick, which I think a lot of people would not necessarily want to ask Carly Lloyd why she missed a penalty kick. So part of that is just, you know, they do kind of know me. They know that this is not necessarily like a personal attack. It is about what happened on the field. But for players that I don't know well, sometimes like you just have to go in and say, this is my part of this job. You have your part of your job. And there is nothing personal here. It is strictly performance driven. But, you know, I do think that at least from like a US or NWSL point of view, having some of those relationships does sometimes give you a little bit of freedom to maybe push a little bit more than you otherwise would have, especially when the performance has not necessarily been a good one.
Grant, what about you? You've been in a few precarious interviews in your life.
I mean, what's interesting to me, what I learned early on in my career is that, you know, I'm going to be on this soccer beat for a long time, and people knew that 25 years ago. And so if I was going to write something, an opinion that I knew would anger someone I covered on my beat, who I was going to be seeing, I would give them a heads up. And then at a certain point, I would give them an opportunity to basically yell at me for like 15 or 20 minutes. And I really wouldn't say anything. Like, it's funny because I worked with the late Tony DeCicco and we became really good friends, just an amazing guy at Fox. And I remember before the 99 World Cup, when he was the coach, I wrote a column for Sports Illustrated being critical of him leaving off Debbie Keller at a crazy time. Mm-hmm. And I remember in Hershey, Pennsylvania, after a game, like a pre-World Cup game, Tony screamed at me for about 15 minutes. And I gave him the opportunity to do that. I didn't sort of like punch back. I'd already made my statement publicly, and he felt like he had gotten out of his system, and we moved on. And that was actually sort of a tone-setting thing for me, because I realized that he wouldn't have yelled at me for 20 minutes if he didn't respect me. And so, like, I think it's important if you're going to be in a situation like that to do that. Now, I'm not doing that all the time. Like, I pick and choose like when I'm going to write an opinion that's strong, but I still do it. And I just think you don't want to be known as like a cheap shot person. I don't. You know, you treat people with respect. But if you have an opinion, you give it. And so, like, been doing this now since 1996, I guess. And people know what I'm about, but that still doesn't mean people aren't going to get upset if I have share an opinion that they don't like.
Alexi, I know that you're known for not having a lot of opinions, but I'm curious what your thought on that is. I've been in the room before when you've had real and fair conversations with players that have been upset about something you've said, and let them talk and then had a conversation with them, and there has not been any negative part of that. You've let them have their say and then had an actual conversation after. How hard is it for them to realize that it's not personal? Like, when you were a player, was there any time where you thought, why is this person doing this? Why, like, as opposed to, hey, this isn't personal, this is their job too, that's their opinion?
Well, they usually don't realize it's personal until they retire and they want my job. So then they understand the reality of what's going on. But to your point, I mean, I've had wives, husbands, kids, grandkids, grandmothers, grandfathers, just acquaintances, obviously friends, come up to me every different place and scream and yell at me and tell me how horrible I am and stuff like that. And then a lot of those end up, then we go get a beer. So you just got to kind of let them get it out of the system and let them be heard. But going back to what I said, there's no way that I can do my job and do it the way I think it needs to be done without at times being critical. I try to be fair, okay? But first off, I'm in the entertainment business. I say that all the time. I am a performer, and how I say things is as important as what I say. But when I am being critical, it's not just because I want to scream and yell and be critical of somebody. It's because this is what I'm paid to give my opinion. And I'm not paid to give an opinion that people agree or disagree with. Okay, it's just my opinion. You may agree with it, and you may not agree with it. But that's okay. That to players, like when I didn't like it when people wrote things, and there's locker room material, and I remember even back in the day, Paul Gardner type of quotes and stuff. Yeah, you hear it all, and don't let them tell you that they don't read it. They read it, they know everything that's going on. Some of them let it affect them more than others, but it's part of the gig. It was interesting when I started working Women's World Cup, and I brought and specifically I brought the exact same way that I would do a Men's World Cup to my performance for the Women's World Cup, and to see the different reaction. And to Meg's point, there was a real recognition and appreciation. Doesn't mean that everybody agreed, and doesn't mean that people didn't scream and yell, but there was a real general appreciation when people stopped screaming and yelling, we actually had a conversation, because that signified to a lot of people that this was being taken seriously and being done in the equal way. And that's so important, because within that is the credibility. And if you're pulling punches, or if you're not doing what you would do in the men's game, then you're not doing your job. And in doing so, I think you're hurting that product, you're hurting the performance, and you're hurting the sport. And so I've tried to, yes, be fair. And look, there's nobody remembers any of the nice positive stuff that you say. It's always the negative critical stuff that you say. So you have to have a balance to be able to do it, but you're never going to get everybody to be happy. And no matter what, players are going to take it personally. And then they get older and they figure it out, and they want jobs in television, and they recognize that they're on the other side. But that's just the way of the world.
Meg, I'm curious, for someone who's covered World Cups, is it difficult sometimes to find something the U.S. women's team didn't do well on a day to have a conversation, if that makes sense? I get when they play Spain and it's a tough game, but I found that like the conversation about Chile or the game against Thailand, it wasn't game related at all, right? Like it was more, and so like it's kind of weird to me that, and we had this conversation, Grant, we had this conversation, Alexi, we had this conversation, that is it kind of strange though sometimes, this is for all of you at this stage, but Meg, start, that when the U.S. women are playing well, like you're almost looking for something to find to stay negatively when they're beating someone up.
I mean, what's interesting is, to your point, the Thailand game, right? There was no discussion of that actual game. It became entirely discourse driven of, is this good sportsmanship? Is it not? Should women behave a certain way? Well, they're terrible role models, right? And like, it's dumb. Like that's all I got. Like, it's really dumb. There was no like actual game analysis, because like, how do you really necessarily pick apart a 13-0 win? But also, I mean, that was such an interesting game just from like a chemistry point of view, right? So there were probably actual things to talk about in that game that would have made a feature. And instead, I'm out here saying like, can everyone please calm down? Can men essentially stop talking about this team for a few minutes, and maybe we can move on to some actual like meaningful, what does this mean for the rest of the World Cup? So, I mean, I think it's interesting though, because then also you look at, I think a better indication of some of these conversations is something like the CONCACAF qualifiers, where they roll through those games, right? And again, like it becomes a lot less necessarily about how the US is actually playing, and it becomes a lot more about how they roll through these CONCACAF opponents, 8-0, again, like double digits. But when I went and covered the Olympic qualifiers, it like, yes, I wrote a story about actually how the U.S. women's national team were trying to basically urge CONCACAF to do better, but also, you're looking at Ali Krieger shifting into a center back role for the U.S. women's national team, and she's working on entry passes, like trying to find those stories, because there are small things happening within this team, roster stuff, depth stuff, that my readers care about. And that's instead like, that's how you have to shift the coverage, instead of, like this is the same problem that we get in NWSL, where you get these big picture, like, can the NWSL survive, right? Like U.S. women's national team beating someone 13-0, like women's soccer is terrible, right? Because we have these inequalities. You can tell all of these stories, and that's the infrastructure on the media side that I think still needs to be built, that people are actually telling both of these stories.
So Alexi, I was on the road doing it, but I don't think you had that take at all about the 13-0 from that point of view. But in general, when you're covering the U.S. women's team, I've heard you talk about, it's hard to talk about that game. They just won 8-0, right? For me to sit there and talk about they were great. Yeah, they were great. It was 8-0. You've talked about their second team would be a better competition when they're playing themselves. Like, how hard is it to cover the women's team when they're rolling?
I mean, it's not hard because Americans love winners, and there's nobody that wins more when it comes to soccer than the U.S. team. Now, my audience when I'm talking after that game is very different than what Meg's audience is at times, and so I have to kind of get big and broad and because there's just a lot of people that come into the tent, especially when it comes to a World Cup, and so I think we do have a responsibility to talk about those big things. I don't think it hurt the credibility, and I don't think we would have been doing our job had we not talked about the reaction. And when it comes to soccer, this is nothing new. We've been doing this. We have these moments that happen every 4 years where people get into soccer, and we want to make sure that when the circus leaves town, that as many of them as possible stick around. And so you kind of have to hook them in and you have to draw them in. And also, while we at times do steer the narrative, sometimes it also just gets made by itself. And that particular moment, that story coming out, that's what people wanted to talk about, whether people that were had been around soccer for a long time or not. And I know it's frustrating because we've all been there, because we feel like, well, there's so much more to talk about. But look, I don't care how people get into the tent. I just want to get them into the tent. If they want to talk about that, and I can throw off a million hot takes on that, that's fine. Because once people get in there and they see what this soccer community is, then we can get into some of the other stuff with those ones that want to stick around and hang in. Our biggest problem for so long, and it continues to be, is just getting people not just to get into the tent, even to know that there's a tent there. And these World Cups in particular are places where we can do that.
Yeah, we spent a fair amount of time on the road in France, and I'm curious. I remember talking to Phil Neville the day before the England game about playing the U.S., and he basically said, and I'm definitely paraphrasing, "Look, we've got one chance to win this, so we're just going to go for it. And if we lose, 13-0, so be it. But we got to go take our chances." I'm curious, as a reporter, when you see a team, and for that matter, a moment like that where Megan Rapinoe kind of takes over a World Cup, like how your eyes light up and how you're like, oh my God, this is how I get to cover something like that. When something, especially when it's a home team for you, a U.S. team that you've spent so many years, like how does that affect you or change what you're doing all of a sudden?
First off, I'm surprised Phil Neville didn't try to plant you to ask a question in the press conference about the U.S. doing something at their hotel.
He was great with us. To be fair to him, he was spectacular.
Phil Neville, man. Anyway, I love covering World Cups, men's World Cups, women's World Cups. Women's World Cups are slightly different to cover for me than men's, because for the women's World Cup, it's so much about the U.S. team and for the U.S. audience, more so than when I'm covering a men's World Cup. Obviously, the U.S. wasn't involved in the last men's World Cup, but it really became about you needed to know your stuff about all 32 teams in that tournament, and you do for the women's team too, for all the teams. But because the U.S. sticks around these tournaments, wins them, and gets so much of a share of the attention, that becomes the whole thing. And it is really exciting because you have a very large audience in the United States following everything that you're doing. For me, and my guess is Meg probably experienced this a little bit too, during the tournament, the Women's World Cup in France. It's a long tournament. You're trying to come up with story ideas that are different, and it's not always the same. There's a limited amount of access that you've got. When you see Megan Rapinoe doing what she was doing during that tournament, that becomes a huge thing. And she's gold when it comes to quotes. And so anytime you get an opportunity to interview Megan Rapinoe, even if it's with like 20 other journalists like crowding together and you're like holding your recorder like this, you do it, because every word she said during that tournament was useful. You used it. And so, you kind of learn to prioritize things. For me, a story that I did after the semifinal was, Kristen Press had scored in the semifinal starting for Megan Rapinoe and then pointed up to the sky. And we had known a little bit about why she was doing that, but not a lot. And she had lost her mom, it turned out. And it came up a little bit post-game, but it hit me that I had a random meeting with Kristen's dad, who was staying at my hotel at the 2016 Olympics in Brasilia, and we'd actually had breakfast together for like an hour, and we'd stayed in touch. I never interviewed him or anything, but I knew he was there, and so I texted him that night, and I was like, "Would you be up for meeting up for coffee in the morning?" And he sort of told me the story of what had happened and how it had impacted him and Kristen and the family. And that's the story I wrote between the semifinal and the final. And that was a really emotional story, but I also felt good about being able to tell that story through his eyes, because Kristen wasn't really in a place to do that herself. And, like the longer the U.S. sticks around in a tournament, the more opportunities you have for that. And so I'm sure that'll be the case if the U.S. men get to the next World Cup and maybe stick around longer than the opening group stage.
Lex, I want to ask you about a U.S. men's moment that was the changing moment at the time. 2010, Landon Donovan's goal that put them into the next round. And similarly, the year after, Abby Wambach's goal against Brazil, both called by Ian Dark, a friend of ours. I'm curious, looking back at it, when that ball goes in and you were a mile away from me in the studio, just like what goes through your mind as a commentator at that stage, not just a former U.S. national team player, but someone who gets a chance to think to himself, wow, this could be a massive moment in something I'm working on.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in a World Cup, everything is monumental and
sure.
Explodes or has the potential to explode. And you're also dealing right now, when you're talking about a moment in time now where the information is instantaneous. And so it's not just us seeing it and then it's just going to be disseminated out in the world as a trickle in back in the 1900s, back when I was playing, but it just goes out immediately and you can pull it up on your phone and there it is. So everybody is seeing it to it. And so while it's not instantaneous, it's pretty close in terms of the reaction that's going around. And then, we have that instantaneous feedback as to what the world is talking about. And, you knew that moment was going to be special. You knew that moment was going to, because look, there's not a lot of goals in the game normally, right? And so when you have that moment, all of those people that I talked about that have come into the tent that maybe aren't necessarily quote unquote soccer people, that's something that they can hang on to. Doesn't matter whether you ever followed soccer before. When that happens and the celebration and the all the different things that you see, you can't help but be moved by those types of moments. And you go into any World Cup or any type of tournament situation hoping for those moments. Sometimes they come, sometimes they don't. But when they come, nowadays, they're just taken up to a whole nother level. And like I said, that instantaneous type of feedback is such a different type of dynamic than happened long ago. And sometimes it can make it even more, and sometimes it can actually make it even less. But the two instances that you're talking about, I mean, they were special, and they become special the further and further you get. And sometimes, to Meg's point of what we decide to cover, sometimes we're being reactive, and the world is talking about that. And the world recognizes that is a seminal moment and will be a seminal moment, and one that we're never going to forget. And that's where all of the focus goes. But nowadays, it's the world kind of making those decisions, as opposed to in the past where it was more us making those decisions.
Meg, is a Women's World Cup more fun now that there are teams that can compete with the U.S. on a given day? The Spain game to me always will stand out as a day that everyone's like, I never thought the U.S. women's team was going to lose that day, but I thought, whoa, Spain can hang, which I bet you 4 years ago, Spain would have been overrun. So is it more fun for someone covering it, or, hey, I want the U.S. to do well all the time, so I prefer not the nerves?
So it was really, that was the game. I remember I was sitting next to Andy Doss of the New York Times. I remember turning to him, I think at halftime, and being like, I thought I was emotionally distant from this World Cup and felt very neutral until that game, where I was like, wow, I feel extremely stressed. And like, I actually would really like it for Spain. Like, I think it's important for Spain to win those sorts of games, like long term. In my head, I can go like, yes, I would really like some of these countries that I think can be extremely powerful women's soccer countries to grow and to win games like that. I mean, England is in that bucket. I would really, really like for Brazil to succeed at a women's World Cup, right? Watching Marta after that game and watching them exit, right? Like, I have loyalties to a lot of different teams. And so yes, like I do think that now as things start to get more competitive, as we see more investment from a lot more countries, right? Like Spain in a 2023 World Cup, I think is going to be an even more formidable opponent, right? Like if they can figure out that finishing touch, I think I'm walking into that game a lot more scared than I think a lot of people walked into that game in France going like, all right, it's Spain. Like, you know, they probably have it handled. It's going to be like a tough, very tactical game, but ultimately, and then it was nerve wracking. So, but I think that's fundamentally extremely good for the growth of the Women's World Cup. We are going to see the field grow, right? More teams in 2023. And I think we're going to have some growing pains with that. But again, fundamentally, like long term is going to pay off. So from a media point of view, from a my job point of view, it's all only good. But from a mental, like, oh, there are still some emotional threads here running through me, it is a little more nerve-wracking than I think I fully anticipated.
Grant, I'm going a different direction on you. 2009 Confed Cup happens. U.S. is on its way to qualifying at the time you assume they're going to qualify. What's going through your mind when that tournament ends? What are you thinking about a year down the road? Where do you think the U.S. can go? Where do you think that, oh my God, could this be the run that we've all been hoping?
I mean, at the end of the 2009 Confederations Cup in the final, it was 2-0 U.S. versus Brazil in the final at halftime. And I'm on the phone with my Sports Illustrated editors talking about a cover story, you know, and the U.S. having beaten.
You're the one that jinxed them.
Pretty much. And the U.S. having beaten Spain at the height of Spain's powers in the semifinal, and then a very good Brazil team, you know, in the semis and final of a major tournament. And, you know, the goals that the U.S. scored, especially that counterattack goal that Donovan finished against Brazil, that's one of the great goals the U.S. has ever scored. And so, you felt at that point like, you know, in qualifying, that was Bob Bradley's team. They're on their way to winning the Hex. And then in 2010, you know, you felt like they could do something, and they did. You know, they won a group that had England in it. And, you know, listening to Mo Adu talk in the previous panel about being asked his greatest goal and talking about his near miss where he finished and it got chalked off by Komen Koulibaly at the end there.
Well done.
Yeah, it brings back a lot of memories. I felt like, I think there was just a real sense of missed opportunity when they went out in extra time against Ghana, because everything heading into that extra time suggested that the U.S. had the momentum and was going to either win that game or go to penalties. It just felt right heading into that extra time, and their goal, the Ghana goal, kind of came out of nowhere. And if the U.S. had won that game, they would have taken on, I think it was Uruguay in the quarterfinals, which I think was a winnable game. You know, a good Uruguay team, but that was a good U.S. team, and there really was a feeling of what could have been. And I didn't feel that way as much in 2014, even though obviously the U.S. could have won late in in regulation against Belgium, but Belgium really dominated that game. And so, when people ask me, will the U.S. men ever win a World Cup in our lifetimes? I tell them I was in South Korea in 2002 when the U.S. outplayed Germany in a World Cup quarterfinal, which and got screwed by the ref there. And if they'd gotten to the semi, would have played South Korea, a team they'd already had a lot of success against. So you put it in those terms, and yeah, of course the U.S. men could win a World Cup in our lifetime.
Which actually, Alexi, I was about to transition. So we talked about the young players now. And I kind of compare a lot of it to the 2002 team, right? I remember asking Landon going into that, like, how well can you do? And he's like, what do you mean? I was like, well, how far do you think you guys can go? And he's like, well, why can't we win this? I don't understand. Like, what kind of a question is that? And I'm curious, Alexi, like, everyone talked about swagger this week, that they showed a little swagger, some of this team, and we liked it. I'm curious if that's a fair comparison to some of those young players on the 02 team, and obviously a long way away, but just in the sense of why can't we?
I mean, I think that's a, for lack of a better word, an American type of answer, a belief that we can do things that haven't been done before, or that people say that we can't do. And that's, I mean, we apologize sometimes for things that, we shouldn't necessarily apologize. I love that type of attitude. And that has been a type of constant, the reaction to the team this week and that swagger. It's not as if we haven't had skillful players. It's not as if we haven't had swagger, but you know how this goes. It goes up and down. And obviously the epic failure of not qualifying for the last World Cup, that informs a lot of the way that we are looking at this generation. And, there are players in the past that could have played at Juventus. There are players in the past that could be doing the things that these guys are doing. And I caught a little bit of the panel before, and Mo was talking about paving the way and leaving it better than when you started. And, so we all stood on the shoulders of others. And these guys that are doing it right now, there is still a thread that binds all American teams, men, women, doesn't matter. And that is a belief that we can do these things. There's also a little chip on the shoulder because we are not necessarily a soccer playing nation. And I think that manifests in all the things that we do. And whether it's from a women's perspective of maintaining that success and that excellence and continuing even with growing competition, or from a men's perspective of finding a way to do what hasn't been done before. And, but it still requires that swagger, and it requires that American belief. And I don't, I love that. I love that about the players. I love seeing it. It's not always there, but I love seeing it. And I think when it popped its head up this week with this type of team and the way that they played and the way they kind of hold themselves, it excites people, and because we want them to live up to that, and we want our American teams to have swagger, and we see it consistently with the women's team. I think we have seen it at different times with the men's team, but this group of players and where they play and the perception of this players, and then you add that little bit of swagger, it gets people excited.
Meg, what excites you about Vlatko's what he's doing and how he's moving this team forward, which it's the hardest job in all of sports, I believe. I mean, you're taking a team that hasn't lost a World Cup game. Well, they haven't actually lost a World Cup game since 2007 because they drew with Japan. So yeah. It's been a long time. And so I'm curious I once asked Jurgen Klinsmann why he took the Germany job. And he's like, I'm German. I have to take the Germany job. Like, someone offers it, you got to take it. You got to win. I'm curious why Vlatko takes that job and what excites you about him.
I mean, Vlatko, thinking about where he came from in order to become an NWSL head coach, I mean, he was in Kansas City indoor soccer, right? So Vlatko is someone that I've covered since the league started in 2013. I mean, I think he is genuinely one of the loveliest, nicest human beings, right? I mean, he is just a fantastic dude. And he is, I mean, we joke about it. We compare him to Leslie Knope, right? In terms of both great person, but so committed to having a plan for everything. I mean, like, I just remember standing with him after one of the NWSL college drafts, and he's like, I predicted almost every single pick in this draft, like which team would take which player. Like, he is the master of preparation. And so, yes, like, he was doing great things in the NWSL. I mean, the way that he basically guided the Seattle Reign through like the most awful injury-ridden season and still made the playoffs was extremely impressive. But like, this is a guy who wants to take on the next challenge and wants to level up, and to have that brain matched with the resources of US soccer is extremely exciting to me, just in terms of video and scouting and research. Like, this is going to be someone that uses every single tool. And I talked to him right before this past October camp. And I mean, my first question was just, you know, kind of like chit chat, just like, how excited are you to be back? Right? Like, he hadn't seen the team since March, and he just started giggling. Like, I mean, it's just like pure joy. So I'm very excited, but I'm also very excited about the player pool getting wider, scouting some of these players. I mean, Katarina Macario gaining US citizenship, like there's still a lot to be excited about. You know, we're going to start seeing kind of the generation swap happen, which is going to be painful for this fan base. I mean, Megan Rapinoe is going to, you know, get out of the system. Carly Lloyd is going to get out of the system. But you have someone like a Midge Purse, who I think is kind of like, you know, a player that I've spoken to since she got drafted in the NWSL, and is just incredible to watch, and can be kind of like a future voice of this team. You have players like Sam Mewis, Rose Lavelle coming up, going to England, doing their thing. You have someone like Lindsay Horan, have someone like Lynn Williams. Like, there's just, you know, you have to stay ahead. Becky Sauerbrunn said it in the last panel, right? Like, you have to stay ahead, but there's a lot to be excited about. And especially when it comes to Vlatko, about, he wants to set trends. He wants to set trends. And I think that's very exciting to see from a U.S. women's national team standpoint.
Grant, you're going to be put on the spot. Sorry, but I figured you can handle it. I'm curious, all the interviews you've done in the soccer world, what was the one that when you got the yes, you were like, oh, goody, I get to finally talk to this person?
First off, a quick fact check. This is actually a good trivia question. The last time the U.S. women lost the World Cup game, 2011 group stage against Sweden.
Oh, yes. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. They haven't lost a knockout game since 2007. Fair enough.
Correct. But I get pretty fired up for landing interviews and executing on them. And then when you know you've had a good interview, doing the quiet little fist pump afterward. I mean, wow. There's probably a few over the years. I mean, like in early 2010, I got a yes from Didier Drogba at the height of his powers to go to Angola during the Africa Cup of Nations. And he ended up giving me like 2 hours. And it was just incredible. A couple times interviewing David Beckham over the years, did the first big one in 2003 here in New York for Magazine Story. And then there was this long drawn out negotiation process for 2007 when he first joined the LA Galaxy, and we went to Madrid, and that became a cover. And, he was wearing the new top secret LA Galaxy uniform that Alexi had helped design in markets. So, stuff like that, stuff that you probably won't surprise you, like anytime you get a big name to do an interview, like there's different fist pump moments of like, arranging the interview, getting it, and then executing on it, and then seeing the response. So I still get fired up for that stuff.
I understand. I do. Alexi, what about you? Is there some soccer player, men's or women, that you'd be like, I'd love to talk to them. I'd love to have a chat with them. I know that you didn't get to interview Klopp, but he wanted to be interviewed by you, it felt.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, someone that's going to be interesting and topical. I mean, Megan Rapinoe. I mean, that would be fun to go back and forth with her and talk about soccer and life and everything in between, and that type of stuff. Look, you can find obviously the bigger profile resonates more. But when I talk to players, and because we do Zoom calls, and normal times we sit down with them, but we do Zoom calls, and there's a real excitement and I guess a pleasure when I sit down with a player who I don't necessarily know from a personal perspective, and I hear them talk about the game, and I hear the way that they answer questions, and that you can tell that there's something more than just the actual kicking of the ball. And obviously a little bit is selfish reasons, because that this person now and going forward is a good interview and is going to give you that feedback that you want, and stuff that you can use. So as long as you're interesting, and as long as you recognize that we all have a job to do, and that you can help yourself, this is an opportunity for you to sell yourself and use us as a conduit to get that. Nowadays we call it a brand, but really that's what we're talking about here, is that this is going to be a reflection on you. And you have an opportunity here to use us. And some players do, and some players don't. Some players just don't feel comfortable doing it. But the ones that do, those are the ones that end up, for me, being the most interesting.
Meg, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one interview that I had pitched to a player, it was actually Becky Sauerbrunn, who I've talked to a bunch for other stories. But the one story I really wanted to do was she had just been traded to Portland. And I said, okay, next time I'm out there, we're just going to go to Powell's, and all we're going to do is go through that bookstore and talk about books, because she's a voracious reader. I'm a former lit major. Like, that's the dream story for me, is just like probably an hour or two in Powell's, get a cup of coffee, pick out some books, see what happens. So hopefully when travel is a thing again, there's still potential to do that. But I do think that is kind of the joy of my job, is being able to talk to the U.S. women's national team players. I think the biggest fist pump moment for me was sitting with Marta at a picnic table at the Orlando Pride training facility when she got back from the World Cup, and getting to talk with her. I mean, Marta is to me like the player. So I'm hopeful that I get to do something a little bit longer, a little bit more feature-y on her in the future, and get a chance to talk to her again.
Well, everyone, this was awesome. Thank you again, CSS, for setting this up. I appreciate it. Guys, I know two of you very well. Meg, we've met a couple times. So really appreciate you doing this. This was fun. It's good to always chat about where we're headed and where we've been. And you guys have such great perspective on it. So thank you.
Yeah, Shaw, thank you,
everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much again for leading this. And Alexi, Meg, Grant, this has been fantastic. It's really been a pleasure having you all. So thank you again for taking the time to join us. So take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Have a good weekend.